And we go now to a favorite topic for many, tax. And SARS has tightened the rules for South Africans living overseas, making it easier for SARS to audit and claw back taxes. From 2025, South Africans abroad will have to declare their status up front. Let's speak now to Thomas Lobban, the director at Ibex Consulting, to understand what this means and how to stay, crucially, on the right side of SARS. Good evening, Thomas. Great to have you on Power Business. Let's start with the very basics. What exactly has changed with SARS notice of non-resident tax status?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. And to cover your question, previously SARS would issue you a notice of non-resident tax status to confirm that you're no longer subject to worldwide taxation in South Africa, i.e. a non-resident. And that notice itself was issued with an effective date and no details. What's changed now, and a very insidious change at that, is that SARS now includes the legal basis on which you have ceased your tax residency. So, for example, you're no longer resident in terms of our local tax laws, or you're no longer resident in terms of a double tax agreement, for example.
And what counts as a resident for South African tax laws? It's one has to spend a certain amount of time in South Africa in order to qualify for that status, or leave South Africa for a certain number of months in a year in order to be removed as a resident.
Well, I wouldn't judge you for thinking that. A lot of people do, including some advisors, surprisingly. And that is generally the case for most countries around the world. But South Africa is, of course, a special child. In South Africa, we have two tests to determine if you're a tax resident. The first one that's applied is what we call the so-called ordinarily resident test, which looks at your intention backed up with objective factors. And the question that's asked there is whether South Africa is your permanent home, your real home, the place to which you'll ultimately return from any wanderings abroad. And now, if you're not resident in terms of that test, you say, South Africa is not my permanent home, I'm permanently living elsewhere, and I don't intend to return, and SARS agrees with that, then you can become a resident if you spend enough time in South Africa. But that test is a test that you apply each year, looking at the current year and then looking at the past 5 years as well, for you to spend enough time over all 6 years to be a resident in that year. So a little bit complicated.
Okay, so it's actually over the past 5 years. It's not just in that financial year that you're filing for.
Correct, exactly.
Okay, that is a very interesting one. And I'm not sure if many South Africans or enough South Africans abroad know about that. And I hope that they're getting the correct advice. But let's just talk about this specific change in the regulations that you referred to. And why is it so significant for South Africans overseas and returnees?
Well, when you cease tax residency, that basis is just something that you see on your notices now. But a further change that SARS is implementing from this year is not only a record that you have ceased tax residency, you now need to, if you return to South Africa after ceasing tax residency, you need to declare that as well, which, of course, gives SARS an opportunity to examine what they've previously declared, why they're leaving, see if their reasons for returning line up with their initial reasons for leaving, and whether that taxpayer had improperly become a tax non-resident, which, of course, what this all means altogether is that it's a further opportunity for SARS to audit whether you were correctly not taxed on your worldwide income in the past.
So this is a major logistical implementation for SARS to undertake because it sounds like they're really going to need to use technology and human resources to scrutinize residency status and non-residency statuses.
Well, of course. And it can sound odd for somebody like me who's often on the sharp end of the spear with SARS to say it's actually a pretty good move. It speaks to diligent tax administration, at least in this advisor's personal opinion. SARS is, of course, going to be further capacitated with the additional budget allocated to it in Budget Speech V3, shall I say. And this is something that foreseeably will open up further avenues for SARS to audit information to collect additional revenue.
Right, and that's the ultimate goal of SARS and the Minister of Finance, for more revenue to be collected to harmonise different processes. But if someone has been living overseas for several years or even just for a year, what are the kind of audit risks that are now on the table that they could potentially face?
Well, that substantially depends on the legal basis on which they ceased to be a tax resident in the first place. If they ceased to be a resident in terms of a double tax agreement, they would have done so with the understanding with SARS that they always intended to return. So that audit might, if it happens, might look like SARS checking to see if their information aligned with them being a non-resident under the DPA the entire time they were abroad until they declare that they're no longer a non-resident. But where it's very dangerous is if somebody previously declared that they no longer see South Africa as their permanent home and they don't intend to permanently return, and then they subsequently do return, that very, very much is high risk, like I mentioned. That's where SARS will likely more deeply scrutinize what their immigration motives were, what their history is, possibly even including international income, and of course their global asset portfolio for potential obligations in declaring offshore income or capital gains. So it's where somebody has declared that they don't intend to permanently return. Those are the highest at risk, I would at least say.
And what kind of documentation or the kind of practical steps do people need to do? The people that you referred to who have declared that they've moved overseas permanently?
Well, how long is a piece of string? What I'll lead with here is to say that taxes generally is based on the balance of probabilities. You need to always seek documentary evidence and make sure that your evidence outweighs SARS evidence, if you think about it like the scales of justice. Validating at least with documentary evidence the reasons for your return to South Africa, what changed? And these could be deeply personal reasons, as they sometimes are. Things don't work out when you go abroad. Canada is far too cold. I don't know anybody in the Middle East. These can be valid reasons personally for a taxpayer, but when you deal with SARS, you're dealing with the legal question of your residency. And that may not itself be relevant. Something like an ailing parent or the loss of your job or immigration status in the other country may hold more weight. But again, it's something that needs to be determined in each case, and always when it comes to good tax planning, it's done in advance, which means in advance of your return wherever possible.
And so one of the major piece of advice is to plan in advance. Any other kinds of advice to people to managing their tax status and their residency status proactively?
Absolutely. South Africa is one of those countries that has a lot of expatriates abroad. And as a taxpayer who often deals in this space with years of experience, I can tell you that many, many people have quietly left South Africa, in some cases many, many years ago, and have never done anything about their tax status in South Africa, never formalized the fact that they have ceased to be a tax resident. And for those taxpayers, now is definitely the time to do so. And for those taxpayers who find themselves planning to return to South Africa for whatever reason, now is absolutely the time to do so. Formalize your status.
And what's the window period, do you think, that people have to get their status in order?
I wouldn't say that there is a window period. I would say that it's always an acting of situation because, again, that piece of string analogy, once SARS comes knocking, it's too late, and there's not much that you can do about it. You're now giving excuses rather than building a case.
All right. Thanks very much. That's Thomas Lobban giving some dire warnings there for South Africans living overseas about changes to SARS regulations around the way that they're taxing South Africans living abroad, South Africans who have maybe moved to another country over 20 years ago. Thomas is the director at Ibex Consulting.